I'm Mr. Beat, and I have another confession to make. I used to be a really big fan of Joseph James Rogan. Like, a really big fan.
Train by day, Joe Rogan podcast by night, all day.
Yeah, that's the guy. Joe Rogan, the comedian, actor, UFC commentator, reality TV host, and most famously, podcaster. I'm serious, William. I loved him. I loved him like dogs love to smell dog pee. Okay, maybe that was a weird metaphor, but for a period of about 8 years of my life, I was constantly listening to Joe's podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience.
And the elites themselves believe they're racing using human technology to try to take our best minds and build some type of breakaway civilization where they're going to merge with machines.
Yeah, the Joe Rogan Experience. During those 8 years, I pretty much listened to every single episode. Well, other than the UFC and Fight Companion episodes. I couldn't care less about mixed martial arts. But yeah, that's thousands of hours of my life listening to this.
These monkeys, these apes rather, started consuming psilocybin mushrooms, and it led them to be more creative.
And I wasn't the only one, dude. There are others. The Joe Rogan Experience is one of the most popular and influential media programs in history. I'm sure you've heard of it. I mean, that's probably why many of you clicked on this video to watch. For many years, it was the #1 podcast around. And remember, there are like literally millions of podcasts out there. Like, even my great-grandfather has a podcast. And he's dead. Hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people at this point have listened to at least one episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. It's helped launch the careers of countless guests and dominated the culture, helped presidents get elected. I listened to Joe Rogan so much it felt like he was legit an actual friend of mine. You're looking at a picture taken of me and a woman who, for some strange reason, married me. You may know her as Mrs. Beat. This picture was taken in 2014, and if you asked Mrs. Beat what she thought of Joe Rogan at that time, she probably would have rolled her eyes and said that she was annoyed that I constantly brought him up in every conversation we had. Oh, that reminds me of the Joe Rogan episode I was listening to the other day. Oh man, you should check out the latest episode of Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan had a guy on who thinks he's seen Bigfoot 6 times. Joe Rogan says we should take more vitamin D to increase our life expectancy.
Matt, shut up about Joe Rogan.
For people who are watching who may think that I'm making this up, convince them that I actually was a really big Joe Rogan fan.
In preparing for this, I searched Joe Rogan in my email on August 14th, 2013. You were excited that he might do meet and greets and you were wanting to meet him.
But eventually Mrs. Beat got into him too. I even convinced her to let me spend way too much money to see him perform his stand-up comedy live in Kansas City back in 2018. But by 2020, my perception of Joe Rogan had begun to change. I found myself skipping episodes more and more. I found myself getting annoyed with him more and more. By the end of 2021, I had stopped listening to him altogether. The parasocial relationship I had with him was over. In this video, I'm gonna explain why I stopped listening to Joe Rogan. I'm excited to say that this video is once again sponsored in part by Cook Unity. As you can see, they ship more food right to my door. It's extremely convenient, and the food is high quality, featuring fresh produce, responsibly raised meats, and chef-crafted meals. Hundreds of meals to choose from, by the way. Not only that, my whole family loves to eat these things, and I'm gonna eat one right now because I'm hungry. And it's great, too, because I don't have to cook. Today, I'm enjoying Chef John DeLucci's white truffle mac and cheese with crispy breadcrumb topping. You got easy instructions here, all the ingredients, when they packed it, when to use it by. All right, let's go. Cook Unity is offering my viewers 50% off their first order of chef-made meals right to your front door. Click the link in the description of this video and use my code MrBeat50 for 50% off. Thanks to Cook Unity for sponsoring this video. Before I explain to you why I stopped listening to Joe Rogan, I think it makes sense to explain why I started listening to him in the first place. The day was December 16th, 2011. I tuned into The Tonight Show to watch Jay Leno interview one of my favorite politicians of all time, Ron Paul. If you don't know, Paul was a popular congressman from Texas running for president at the time. And to my surprise, out comes Joe Rogan to enthusiastically endorse Ron Paul for president. I truly did not see this coming. You see, before December 16th, 2011, I didn't really like Joe Rogan at all. I knew him from two things, mainly News Radio and Fear Factor, and his appearances in both of those shows did not convince me to like him. In fact, I thought he was annoying at best and obnoxious at worst on Fear Factor. I couldn't stand the guy. But then here he is on Jay Leno endorsing my boy, Ron Paul. And I was like, maybe I should revisit this Joe Rogan fella. Soon after this, I noticed his podcast was one of the most popular podcasts in the world, so I gave it a try. I was hooked. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was rough. This was back when Brian Redband was on the program producing. The audio had issues.
We have 2 commercials that we do. Oh, good. I don't know how to use Windows, little Jimmy. We just switched over to Windows.
Many of his guests seemed to be under the influence of drugs. Many of them didn't know what the heck they were talking about half the time. But they were having fun, man. Good vibes and good open-minded people. And I felt like I was eavesdropping on some really intriguing conversations. Plus, it was like a peek behind the curtain. Before podcasts like the Joe Rogan Experience, we rarely got such intimate glimpses into the private lives of big-time Hollywood celebrities. I got even more into the podcast when Joe started inviting guests who are outside of his circle of comedian and MMA friends. He started having actual experts in specialized fields on. Doctors, journalists, scientists. But here's the thing. Whenever Joe had guests on who were experts in specialized fields, he didn't pretend to know more than them. He showed humility. He shut up and let them talk. When he did talk, he often asked questions. And here's the most important part. Joe was curious. In those early years, Joe let his own curiosity guide each and every interview. He had people on whom he clearly disagreed with, but heard them out anyway. Sure, he still had stuff he passionately cared about, like the legalization of recreational drugs and UFOs. However, if he didn't know much about a topic, he shut his mouth and listened.
That multiverse might be infinite and eternal.
Where are they?
Outside of our universe.
How's that even possible?
Of course it's possible.
I understand. I'm not questioning it.
Okay, no,
I just
here,
would like you
here's
to
one.
define it. This idea that there's nothing or no thing, that we can't even wrap our head around nothing, because we would think of a thing, that there's no thing, but there's never a thing.
Right.
Right. But how do we, or why don't we just say we don't know? I don't know enough about astrophysics, about space travel, about the science that's, the work that's been done, about how to get a rocket to the moon and back. I definitely don't know enough.
Now, I should say he also had people on who were not experts in their fields, but he believed them to be experts because he already wanted to believe in what they were saying. Also, when he did tend to have actual experts on, they tended to be experts who were just better at talking than most of their colleagues. It didn't mean they were more knowledgeable than their colleagues. They just could communicate the stuff better. And yeah, if he grew to like the experts, he'd invite them back on, and that expert would then proceed to often talk about stuff they clearly knew very little about. Despite all that, Joe was a likable person because he always seemed so down to earth and authentic. He wasn't constantly trying to push any agenda. He constantly admitted that he didn't know what he was talking about when it came to most things. By the way, that's all of us. All of us don't know much about almost everything. And that's okay. Overall, though, I just appreciated Joe's almost childlike curiosity and devotion to learning. As early as 2019, though, I did begin to notice that he tended to mostly have people on the show who he already agreed with, and if he disagreed with a guest, even if they were a friend, he'd push back a bit much further than I'd like. But things really went downhill for the show quickly during the COVID-19 pandemic. When's the first time you remember me saying something negative about Joe Rogan?
Well, that would be around the pandemic.
I swear, that pandemic broke so many people's brains. And don't get me wrong, I get it. It was a difficult and stressful time. Millions of people died. The lockdowns sucked. We had to sacrifice many of our freedoms. In my opinion, this especially seemed to upset a lot of privileged folks who weren't used to sacrificing their freedoms. But due to so many folks going through hard times during the pandemic, a lot of people indeed got more radicalized. That included many celebrities who then influenced millions of others to become more radicalized. And let me be clear here. When I say radicalized, all I mean is that they had views more radically different in opposition to the status quo. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have radicalized views. I mean, we do need to get radicalized if things get bad enough. Joe did not like the lockdowns and public health restrictions one single bit. He was absolutely devastated that he had to cancel all his shows and his fun plans. And throughout March and April of 2020, during those particularly restrictive times, he spent most of the time on his podcast complaining about how all of us couldn't just go where we wanted or do what we wanted.
They're treating everybody like babies. This is what it is, man. They're treating everybody like you're not allowed to make your own decisions, including business owners that have spent a ton of money opening up these outdoor cafes and outdoor restaurants, and then they don't even supply any science. There's not even they are essentially autocrats, right? They're a dictator.
Still, he stayed curious, at least at the beginning of the pandemic.
Well, tell everybody what you do, Michael.
Well, thank you. I'm, for lack of a better term, a medical detective. I've spent my whole career tracking infectious diseases down, trying to stop them, trying to understand where they come from so we can make sure they don't happen in the first place.
He had Dr. Michael Osterholm on, an internationally recognized expert in infectious diseases. You can go back and watch this episode. It is aged like wine. Holds up very well. Michael Osterholm is truly an expert. Nearly all of what he said was true and came true. Joe was receptive at the time, but in the back of his mind, you can probably guess he didn't want to hear any of it. 2 years later, Joe had him back on, and he was more combative against Osterholm this time. The second time Osterholm was on, I was astounded by how arrogant Joe seemed, despite the literal freaking expert across the table from him remaining humble.
Does the vaccine cause any pericarditis?
No,
or
none. We've
none?
seen zero. Zero cases. Zero
Really?
cases pericarditis, zero cases of arrhythmias. But the
Zero.
virus does it.
Zero.
Zero.
That's not what I read.
No,
I
it
read
is.
this
It is.
whole thing about vaccinated people in Israel, like that there was a giant surge of vaccinated people.
No, the surge is primarily in unvaccinated people.
Yeah, he hasn't had him on ever since. But let's go back to the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic.
COVID-19!
3 weeks after Joe had Michael Osterholm on, things had already gotten so bad that everyone was doing everything remotely, even Joe. His remote guest this time was someone he had on his show before, Dr. Peter Hotez, an internationally recognized expert on vaccines and tropical disease control. If you go back and watch the episode, again, practically every episode is still up. If you go back and watch it, you'll notice that Joe is still mostly trying to learn and staying quiet. But he's also visually frustrated.
How long can we go? I mean, if look, let's take economics out of it. What would you think if there was no concern whatsoever about economic loss and the damage to the economy? What would you recommend in terms of just purely from a medical perspective?
While this episode has also aged like wine, Peter Hotez is also truly an expert who forecasted the pandemic and the response accurately. He later became the target of a backlash against pandemic restrictions. And yep, Joe hasn't had him on since. You see, Joe apparently thought he was done learning everything about the COVID-19 pandemic at that point, and he felt like he didn't need to teach his audience anything new about it either. Most of the COVID-19 coverage after this was reactionary. He didn't have experts on. He had just people who didn't know much about the virus or pandemic giving their opinions about it, backed up by little evidence. It was mostly comedians complaining about how their tours were canceled. And then on December 31st, 2021, Joe decides to have this guy on. Dr. Robert Malone used to be a respected doctor who helped make mRNA vaccines and furthered medicine research. However, the pandemic appeared to break his brain too. He began spreading a bunch of misinformation about the safety and effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines. He misrepresented data and used his credentials to gain quite a following online. By the end of 2021, Joe Rogan had already made up his mind about COVID-19 vaccines. He didn't like them. So when Joe found out about Malone, he seized at the opportunity to have him on the podcast to talk trash about them. And sure enough, Rogan's audience generally ate this misinformation right up. Well, this was the last straw for me. I haven't listened to Rogan ever since. Well, except for the Osterholm episode and the Mike Judge episode. What can I say? I love Mike Judge. Over the past 4 years, if you look at the guests, they're mostly just people Joe already agrees with about most things, or his good friends. From the period of about 2014 to 2019, you'd see a big variety of guests. Since then, it's mostly the same cast of characters, man. Oh look, there's that guy again. Oh look, her again. That guy again. Just as troubling to me, over the past 4 years, Joe has generally shown a complete lack of humility, a humility that legit used to be a big reason why I enjoyed listening to him so much in the first place. Now at this point, you might be thinking, well, Mr. Beats, you just don't listen to him because you don't agree with his political views anymore. That's what it is. His politics is why you no longer listen to him. Well, that's not correct at all. In fact, I probably still agree with the vast majority of Rogan's political views. Many people argue that Joe Rogan's political views have moved further and further to the right in recent years. I actually don't think this is true. Joe has always been a left-leaning libertarian, much like myself actually. He still passionately supports Bernie Sanders and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, who all, and please don't forget this, all three of them still lean to the left politically. He recently had a sitting Democratic senator on as a guest. I think the difference now, though, is he's done adjusting his political views. I think his political opinions are pretty much set in stone. He's done learning new information about public policies. He's done keeping an open mind about politics, and that's a big freaking problem. Put simply, Joe Rogan's curiosity is gone. That childlike curiosity, those inquisitive conversations that drew me to his podcast in the first place, they're just gone. What remains is a dude who is less open-minded and less willing to learn new stuff. And I get it. It's not just Joe Rogan. I think the whole culture is less curious than it used to be. And I think I know why, actually. The YouTuber Alec Watson of the phenomenal channel Technology Connections recently released a video explaining what I've been pondering for several years now. His main hypothesis in the video is that we've collectively grown way too comfortable with having algorithms feed us everything. And you know what? I agree with Alec.
I am seeing mounting evidence that an increasing number of people are so used to algorithmically generated feeds that they no longer care to have a self-directed experience that they are in control of. The more time I spend interacting with folks online, the more it feels like large swaths of people have forgotten to exercise their own agency.
In other words, we trust algorithms too much. We've surrendered our curiosity because we now treat basic research as too cumbersome. Ironically, in a period of history in which so many people pride themselves as being distrustful of those in power or being so-called red-pilled, we trust random people on the internet more than ever. Worse yet, we trust random bots on the internet more than ever. How many of us ask Siri or Alexa or Google a question and just accept it as truth? Sorry if I said anything off, by the way, by just doing that. Heck, how many of us look up anything on a daily basis anymore? Instead, algorithms spoon feed us what we want to see because we fear a life without dopamine. And who can blame us? Life is incredibly difficult out there for many of us right now. We already struggle so much that algorithms allow us to escape from that misery. But we don't realize that those same algorithms perpetuate the misery. They keep it going, and we won't be truly free and happy until we break free from those algorithms. So, I don't know, dude. Maybe Joe Rogan is just like the rest of us, stuck in his algorithms because he thinks it's easier to live his life that way. Or maybe he just likes money.
Oh, I like money.
I don't know. Regardless, I stopped listening to Joe Rogan because he stopped listening to people who disagreed with him. He stopped being humble. He stopped being curious. But you haven't stopped being curious. How do I know this? Because you clicked to watch this video. Sure, algorithms suggested this video for you to watch, but those algorithms suggested this video because you're curious. And you know what? The world will be saved by folks like you. So thank you for staying curious.